Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 17. The ride to Duxbury left Hannibal with too much time to think about the reasons why he had never been back, not since Melinda had been buried. He found himself reluctant to go there despite his provoking, pressing need to find Will, as if the ghosts of his neglected family might hold him accountable for his absence. Now, with no company other than his own thoughts and the surety of seeing her final resting place at last, Hannibal found himself thinking about her. Their childhood friendship was still one of his fondest recollections of his time at Hertford House. She had taken the place of his lost little sister at first, being so close to Misha in age. Hannibal had been besotted the moment they met, taking the role of her protector, much to the amusement of her parents. His middling years had passed in a blur of exploration, climbing trees, being carefree and happy, always with Melinda next to him. His grandfather had tried to discourage their association, but Hannibal had found ways around that, as children often would. Even then, he'd known he would have to marry well when he was of age. He'd been told time after time by grandfather that someone was already picked out for him, that it was settled and contracted, that he would have no choice in the matter. Those warnings had fallen on deaf ears, slamming up against the wall of youthful surety that he knew what was best for himself. He'd been determined to marry Melinda when they were both old enough, the 4 years of difference between them seeming to stretch forever, long enough that his feelings for her had altered from brotherly to something else entirely. And then she'd finally caught up to him, and everything had fallen apart. Hannibal shook off his memories of her, teeth clenching hard with feelings that had not died with her. He urged his horse up the lesser-used trail and cut across the fields, both to shorten the distance and avoid the town itself. The fields gave way to brush in the thick of the tree line, forcing Hannibal to dismount and lead his horse the rest of the way. He came out at the top of the crest and paused, his amber eyes scanning for any sign of Will. He saw Will's mare waiting patiently in the shade, and then he saw Will, sitting on a spread blanket just beyond, talking with animation to a smiling blonde woman who was busy packing the remains of their lunch back into the hamper. It took him aback to see Will there, smiling and relaxed in the company of that woman, and it occurred to Hannibal then that no one had ever asked Will where his preferences lay. Everyone, even his grandfather, who was the most thoughtful of Will, had assumed that, as an Omega, Will would want an alpha male. Seeing them there, Hannibal felt his gut clench with uncertainty, thinking that perhaps in his 6 years living as a beta male, Will's desires ran toward women, as Hannibal's had. Which begged the question why it made him feel so strangely unhappy to consider such a thing, when he had fully intended to breed Will and abandon him all over again. Because you don't intend to. The quiet thought arrived without fanfare, settling into a place that had already been made within him for it, and it had merely come home at last, warm and small, but growing stronger with every heartbeat. Of course he didn't intend to. He'd barely given that addendum a thought since riding out with Will on his rounds. He'd been ensnared in fascination, and new opinions had begun to form. He wanted to know Will. He wanted Will to know him in return. And the only way for that to happen was to enact vast and permanent change, not only for himself, but for those he cared for. Will's laughter reached him, a carefree and easy sound that drifted up to Hannibal on the slight breeze, bringing an answering smile to his mouth and a blossom of warmth to chase away the ugly anxiety that had plagued him all the way to Duxbury. He envied her, this young and animated woman who enticed Will into such an easy mirth. He envied her, but could not begrudge her. Will's laughter was too precious a sound to dislike the source, even if some small part of him simmered with envy because of it. "One day," Hannibal promised, his hands tightening on his stallion's reins. "That sound will not be so rare." When his horse nosed his shoulder, nudging him for his inactivity, he quietly admitted, "He has an uncommon habit of scattering my best-laid plans. I find myself needing to reform them once again." The stallion snorted, and Hannibal rubbed his velvety nose, deciding not to intrude on Will just yet, for fear he would have to see all that relaxed ease tighten into nervous tension. Molly was kind enough to lead Will back to Duxbury, and put a few pumps of water into a bucket for his mare to slake her thirst. The day was turning humid in the late afternoon sun, and Will wearily wished his ride home was shorter. "You came by the main lane, didn't you?" Molly asked, stroking her fingers through the mare's mane as it slurped from the bucket, looking at Will over the top of the saddle and smiling when he nodded. "Just past the shop as you head back. You'll see a trail on the right that cuts as you back toward the cemetery. It angles past the ridge and goes straight across instead of around. It'll save you at least an hour." "Thank you, Molly," Will breathed, glad to have been told. "Here, wait a second," she said, and vanished into the back of her shop. Will stroked his mare's neck and crooned at her, enjoying the faint breeze in his blank slate of mind. He had a lot of information to consider, and all of it was going to change his perception, he knew. He was putting off facing it, putting off that inevitable moment when he would have to look at everything and see Hannibal through the lens it formed. It disturbed him to think that Hannibal might have been responsible for Melinda's death, just as everyone thought. It was as if life was determined he would be attached to those without compassion or compunction. First his father, and now Hannibal. Perhaps it was simply all he deserved when it came down to it. Perhaps, as his father had taught him, he lacked the value required to be allowed the happiness that he had hoped for so foolishly. Seeing that fresh strap on his mare, so new and obvious on his broken-in saddle, the twinge of unease returned with a vengeance, and he was glad for Molly to return and distract him. "Here we go!" she crowed, waving a hat around over her head. "Just what you need." "Molly, no, I can't." "Sure you can," she said, leaning over the horse to pluck the hat atop his curls. "It'll keep the sun off a little at least. Ah, don't look so guilty. It's one of my father's old hats. Rubbish, really, so you're doing me a favor by taking it. Only promise you'll get rid of it, okay? It's too shabby to wear any place." Will grinned and nodded, flattered that she would offer it to him, and pushed it firmly down onto his head. "Thank you, Molly. You're very delightful. I really have enjoyed today." "Well, what can I say? Cemetery tours are just my forte," she teased, grinning. "Look, you know where Duxbury is. Don't be a stranger, Mr. Graham, okay? Maybe next time you ride over we can go someplace a little less gloomy." "That would be very nice," Will said, grabbing onto the pommel to swing up into his saddle and get comfortable. "It has truly been a pleasure meeting you, Molly." "I couldn't agree more, Mr. Graham," she said, handing him up his basket and stepping back to give the mare room to turn around. "Have a safe trip, and just follow the trail straight back to Hartford, okay?" "Yes, thank you," Will said, inclining his head at her and clicking his mount into a sedate walk past the edge of the town to the trail, just where Molly had promised it would be. It was too late to prevent Will from finding whatever he'd sought, Hannibal knew. He idled in the tree line out of sight, plucking small flowers that had found purchase at the edge of the wood. He waited until Will returned to Duxbury with his lady friend before he made his way down to the cemetery. It was a somber reunion, almost an intrusion after so long absent, and he felt humbled to find himself back after all these years. The spreading trees kept the place in shadows, cool and comfortable, as the afternoon sun rode high in the sky, a tranquil peace that soothed him. Hannibal moved down towards the rows where his closest kin rested. His father, buried with little fanfare for his disobedience, his little sister Misha, that wretched creature who had ruined his father and cost Hannibal his family, there on her other side, close to the path and far from the proper lectors, but there nonetheless. His grandfather's small admiration for her tenacity, perhaps, a stubbornness which matched his own. He could not look at his mother's grave, not without his stepmother's purring, soft voice reminding him, "There is no love like a mother's love, but you will never understand that, Hannibal. You killed her before she could love you. But I should thank you for that, Hannibal. If you had not, I wouldn't be here." Trembling with the memory, Hannibal took a deep breath to steady his nerves. He had thought of her more and more since returning home, a presence that always shattered him since she'd come home with his father. Death hadn't changed any facet of that where she was concerned. He lived on, his vision, as grandfather had said, skewed by what she had shown him. He didn't wish to revisit any part of it, or her. Perhaps that was why he was so reluctant to return. He shook off the disquiet that thoughts of her provoked and focused on his little sister's final resting place. Once he had himself under control, he bent and placed the small bunch of meadow flowers on Misha's grave, sighing into the quiet afternoon. "I will bring you a proper bouquet next time, my little one." He felt guilty for not having come to see her even once in these past years. When he'd been young, he'd come nearly every day when the grief was fresh. Those moments had slowly drawn farther and farther from one another as other things cracked the shell of his sorrow. By the time he had married Melinda, he'd come only on the anniversary of Misha's birth and death, no longer able to summon the tears that had once flowed so freely. He trembled as he knelt there among the dead in that peaceful shade, the wind picking at his hair like ghostly fingers, cool and formless. He stared at her stone, but it was the last memory of her that he saw instead, that split second between life and death, and the way the light drained from her eyes. She'd been so frightened, trembling on her mother's lap, and reaching for him in the darkness. None of them had been prepared for what had happened. One moment she'd been alive, and the next he'd watched her slip away by the ceaseless flash of lightning crackling overhead. "Will you forgive me?" he asked, tracing the lettering of her name and replacing the memory of her slack, bloodied face with her sweet little smile. "I couldn't save you, Misha. Why couldn't I save you?" "Get away!" The voice of that woman cracked like a whip in his memories, rejecting him violently even at the moment of her death. "Get away!" Even then she'd held Misha away from him, pushing him back with her hand, batting him away as the carriage filled with water and the storm raged around them. Her last words on this earth had been admonishment, a reminder that she did not want him, that he wasn't hers as Misha was, that even in death she could not abide him. Hannibal took a breath, the tremble becoming a shudder. He wiped at his face impatiently, pushing that moment away, shuddering it up again behind the walls he'd built to protect himself. He conjured all of his fond moments with his sister instead, those cherished times when her laughter filled the world, long afternoons spent exploring the gardens and catching fireflies in the dusk. He smiled then, despite his sorrow, recalling her dashing about in her mother's discarded gown, bawling at the top of her lungs that she would be queen one day. "Do you remember what I said to you then, Misha? I said that you were already my queen." "She was an Omega. Disappointment requires expectation, Will. Did you have expectations of me?" "Once, maybe, but only for a short time." "I exist, Lord Clarges. That is offense enough on its own." Hannibal flinched, imagining what he would have done to any person who had treated Misha as he had treated Will. Had anyone dared insult her, called her repellent, sent her fleeing from her new home in nothing but her underclothes, been even a fraction as nasty and spiteful with her as he had been with Will Graham, he would most certainly have killed them. "I've missed you, my little darling, so very, very much," he whispered, tears finally forming in his eyes, because no matter how long it had been, he would never stop longing to see her again. "So much. I only hope, had you lived, that you would have made me someone much different than I am now." She would not, he knew, love him for his treatment of Will, and he could not, he knew, continue along the same path of blind prejudice that he'd followed since her death. Had he known years ago, perhaps he would have changed, but there was no way to go back and change the things that had already happened, much as one might wish to. Changing the future, however, was entirely within the realm of possibility. Wiping his face with his handkerchief, Hannibal took a steadying breath and left Misha's final resting place with a loving, lingering look. He did not stop at his father's grave, stranger that he had always been, a stern and bewildering taskmaster, resenting the place Hannibal held in grandfather's heart. He moved, instead, to stand silently at Melinda's grave for the very first time. He brought no flowers, nothing to appease a spirit which must no doubt rail against an unkind fate. He brought only himself, 16 years removed from the boy who had looked down into her face as she died and refused to grant her forgiveness. "How bitterly you must hate me now," he breathed, stiff and somber at the foot of her grave. "Gone all these years and your secrets buried with you." He crouched down, fingers digging into the shorn grass and deeper into the crumbling earth, as if he could reach down and find her sleeping, snow-white, waiting for a prince who never came. "I always imagined that I could never forgive you," he told her, reaching for a memory of her, surprised that the details of her face came back so effortlessly. "The moment you died," he cut off, flinching when that moment was there before him. "I should have said I forgive you, Melinda.
even though I hadn't in that moment. I should have said it and let you rest. You were young and foolish, and had the misfortune to have only myself to turn to. 16 years too late, Melinda, but I forgive you, and I hope wherever you are, that you can forgive me in turn.
He pushed to his feet, tears misting his eyes but refusing to fall.
I have forgiveness of my own to earn. I will have to tell your story one day, Melinda, our story soon. Believe me when I say the one I will tell it to would never judge you. He's a far better man than I am.
He felt the breeze pick up again, a brush of life against his face, and for a moment he imagined she was smoothing his cheek, as she so often had.
I am sorry for what you suffered, Melinda,
he whispered, and quietly left the cemetery, knowing it was but the first of many apologies he would soon have to make. Will arrived back to Hertford House that afternoon to an unusual reception, namely a furor. It was quite unusual to see the staff of Hertford House at a loss, but Will knew the moment he reached the house that they were, indeed, entirely at just such an unfortunate event. His curiosity momentarily tamping down his anxious suspicions about Hannibal, Will rode up to the small group of gathered footmen, and the tall, rather surprising figure they seemed to be watching. "May I help?" he offered, reining the mare to a stop with a slight smile on his face. The scent of an alpha teased his nose, wood smoke and leather, and strangely familiar.
"Lord Clarges,"
the alpha said, turning toward him and sweeping off his hat, his voice soft and husky, his posture strangely diffident for an alpha.
"I've been sent by your sister, Lady Rathmore. Do you remember me, Lord Clarges?"
He looked up at Will with such earnest hope that his desire to be recognized could almost be tasted. "Francis," Will breathed, his memories aligning the scent and the sight of him to his childhood. "Francis Dollaride, yes, I remember you." He dismounted, handing his tired mare off to one of the staff so he could ask, "Why have you not gone into the house? Is there some problem?" Mr. Hawkes, looking harried and annoyed at being late to greet him, appeared in the doorway to offer,
"Mr. Dollaride has refused to come in. I do apologize for the inconvenience. It is extremely unusual for an alpha to be in such a position."
Will nodded, recognizing the issue at once. Francis had, for his own reasons, decided to wait without for Will's acceptance, and, being an alpha, the rest of the staff did not feel comfortable forcing the issue. It was bound to cause more problems in the future, he knew, but for now he was relieved to have someone near him who was not connected to Hertford House and had nothing to gain from misleading him. "Would Lord Clarges not come?" Will asked, wondering why his husband had not made an appearance by now, drawn by the tension and scent of another alpha.
"Lord Clarges left some few hours after you, Mr. Graham. Lord Clarges,"
Francis corrected, bristling slightly. "Please, Francis," Will said, lifting his hand but hesitating to touch him. Though he could match the man before him to the youth he'd known as a child, he was not entirely sure he should be so familiar with him. "The staff all call me Mr. Graham, as should you, and I apologize for your reception. You are very welcome here." Francis relaxed, the tension running out of his rather alarming frame, which dissipated the strange consternation and worry that had gripped the servants of Hertford House. "Mr. Dollaride will be accompanying me about," Will announced, looking at each of them in turn. "My sister, Lady Rathmore, is planning to join me here at Hertford House, and has sent Mr. Dollaride ahead. As he has come at both her request as well as the request of my father, I hope that you will treat him kindly and give him every accommodation that Hertford House can offer."
"We have taken the liberty of preparing a place in the men's quarters for Mr. Dollaride,"
Mr. Hawkes said, firmly back in control of the situation.
"If you would like to go round to the back entrance, Mr. Dollaride, I will have one of the boys familiarize you." "Thank you,"
Francis softly said, but hesitated a moment before producing a letter from his jacket and offering it to Will. "What's this?" Will asked, taking it while Mr. Hawkes stood watching, politely waiting to assist. Frowning, Will turned the envelope over in his hands, finding no markings at all except his name and a plain wax seal that was hastily and sloppily applied. "How did you come to be in possession of this?" he asked, searching Francis's face.
"I stopped in town to ask the way," Francis murmured. "A boy from the village brought it to me, Mr. Graham. When I asked him where he got it, he would not say, not even with the promise of candies. A wild little boy, Mr. Graham. I was reluctant to accept it."
"I'm glad you did, for my sake," Will said, slipping his fingers beneath the wax seal and prying it up, ripping the cheap paper somewhat. He unfolded it, his concern growing with every heartbeat. He did not recognize the writing, and there was no signature he noticed at once. He read it once, then again, his heart pounding hard in his chest, hoping that the second time the contents would have changed. "Mr. Graham, you are in mortal danger. Your husband intends you harm. Indeed, he has attempted once already to murder you, just as he did the former Lady Clarges. Please, consider this warning from a place of good intentions, and remove yourself from Hertford House at once."
"Mr. Graham?"
Mr. Hawkes inquired, concern replacing his usual stoic calm.
"Are you quite all right, Mr. Graham?"
Francis watched him with unblinking, unsettling intensity, as if able to taste Will's sudden anxiety. "Yes," Will said, barely a whisper. He folded the letter and pushed it into his jacket pocket, clearing his throat to say with more conviction, "Yes, I am quite well, thank you." The girth strap breaking had not been an accident, and Will had never told anyone of it, outside of Matthew Brown, who would certainly never send him such a letter. Only someone who had cut the strap, or else witnessed it being cut, would know that his accident was no accident in truth. It did occur to Will to wonder if the culprit might not be the very one sending him the letter, but there was nothing anyone could gain from trying to separate him from his husband when they were little better than strangers to one another. It did seem more reasonable that the warning was genuine, and the threat real.
"Mr. Graham,"
Francis said, pitching his voice low so only Will could hear him.
"If there is something I should know—"
"Ah, here comes Lord Clarges," Mr. Hawkes remarked, sounding vastly relieved. "What wondrous timing he has." Francis tensed and Will turned, stepping back into the shadow the large Alpha threw. Hannibal, spying Will lingering out front, urged his horse to gallop the last stretch to Hertford House, and drew up short when the acrid, sulphuric scent of another Alpha reached him. "I've been looking for you," he said, choosing to address his mate first, eyes sweeping from Will's slender, composed form to that of the tall, glowering Alpha hovering just behind him. "I went to Duxbury," Will said, assessing Hannibal as he dismounted, flushed and bright-eyed from his outing. Will shielded his gaze with his lashes, studying Hannibal's reaction when he said, "I wanted to see where your relatives are buried."
"Unfortunately, the most annoying among them have not yet been planted there," Hannibal said, offering Will a wry smirk. He tipped his head toward the Alpha and asked, "And may I ask who your visitor is?" "Francis Dollaride," the Alpha said, bristling as if Hannibal offered some threat. Almost as an afterthought, he added, "My lord."
"Francis is the god I spoke to you of," Will said, unnerved by the tension that rose between the two of them. Mr. Hawkes, never a fool, hastily gestured the waiting footman back inside in case things escalated.
"Ah, Mr. Dollaride,"
Hannibal said, wondering why Francis was staring at him with such intensity, but finding himself returning it, his instincts.
"Of course you're here to prepare the place for Lady Rathmore's comfort, I expect. And when is she due to arrive?" "She comes as she pleases, my lord." "Mr. Dollaride, if you will go round to the back, please," Mr. Hawkes said, choosing an opportune moment to intervene. "We will get you settled directly." The look in his eye skirted the edge of a challenge, but he obeyed Mr. Hawkes with surprising meekness once Will gave a nod, vanishing around the side of the house with that fire and iron scent of his lingering to wrinkle Hannibal's nose. "You failed to mention Mr. Dollaride as an Alpha," Hannibal said once he had gone, gesturing Will ahead of him through the door which Mr. Hawkes graciously held wide for them. "Are you rethinking your stance that I am not bonded?" Will asked, turning over his hat and the basket to the staff. "Perhaps Francis is my Alpha, and I have merely brought my lover here to spite you, as you wish to spite me." "No, I am not rethinking my stance. You are far too honest to have been lying, and far too proper to have concocted such an inelegant situation, but I find it troubling nonetheless."
"It makes little difference," Will said, putting some distance between them as they moved through the dim, cool foyer. "You cannot refuse his presence."
"I have no means or right to refuse his presence, little though I like the idea of an Alpha dodging steps of my unbound spouse," Hannibal said, pausing there on the carpet and turning to face Will.
whose eyes were even more elusive than usual.
"There's a reason alphas are not admitted into service, Will. They tend to provoke their employers."
"Unless you are less than half the alpha you believe you are," Will said, his blue eyes fastening on Hannibal's for a split second, firm and fiery. "Then you should have little problem establishing your control over the staff of Hertford House, Francis included. But you should not trouble yourself, Lord Clarges. He has come at the insistence of my sister and father, and will be attaching himself to me." Hannibal frowned.
"There are a myriad issues with that statement, Will."
"None of which involve you or require your attention. Please excuse me."
"Will, wait,"
Hannibal said, reaching out to lay his hand on Will's arm. There was no force behind his touch, but Will stilled all the same, nostrils flaring and his anxiety spiking. Hannibal dropped his hand immediately, his fingers brushing softly over the fabric of Will's jacket.
"Did you find anything of interest in Duxbury?"
"Yes," Will said, staring up at him with a directness that spoke volumes to his husband. "A great many things, Hannibal." Those large blue eyes flicked over him, taking in the minute details he drew such unsettling conclusions from. Hannibal was not at all surprised to hear him ask, "Why does it concern you that I should know of your past, Hannibal?" Hannibal took a deep breath, knowing Will could have gotten very more than a sum of dates laced together with his curious intuition, unless that young lady of his had given him the generally accepted fate of his former wife.
"There is little happiness in my past, Will,"
he said, noticing how his mate responded to his honesty with almost imperceptible softening.
"And very little worth speaking of. I am frightened of the image you will have of me when all is said and done."
Will's mouth curved down in a frown. Thoughtful, he softly ventured, "Please do not waste a moment of worry on my estimation of you, Hannibal, as I have never wasted a moment of my own regarding your estimation of me."
"Then we are agreed not to trouble one another,"
Hannibal said, a strange sinking feeling fluttering through his stomach. They began to scale the stairs, the silence between them a ghost of what might have been had things not gone so terribly wrong. Wishing that his usual charm would not abandon him in the presence of his young mate, Hannibal said,
"I thought, considering the prior instance, I should tell you that I intend to have a soak, unless you wish to do so."
Will cleared his throat and said, "No, thank you. Were there locks on the doors, it would not be an issue."
"I will have that remedied,"
Hannibal said, lingering there in the hall outside of Will's suite, reluctant to leave him. Strange as it felt to admit it freely, he enjoyed Will's prickly company and wanted to find a way to mend the damage he'd done, especially after the soul-searching he had done over Misha's grave. "Don't trouble yourself," Will said again, turning slightly away, his hand on the door of his suite. "I will be leaving soon, and you won't need them." Hannibal frowned to be reminded of Will's departure, frowned at the way he would not look at him, wondering at his tense posture and frayed nerves. He was a far cry removed from the young man who'd lunched in the shade with a pretty girl from Duxbury.
"Will,"
he said, noting the faint gleam of worry in his mate's eyes when he stirred as if to come nearer.
"I suppose it's too late to ask, but I realize no one has ever taken your tastes into account in regards to this marriage."
Bewildered, Will skated a glance at him and nervously asked, "Does anyone but a man get that luxury?" Hannibal sighed.
"Not usually, no, but in your case I feel it is rather important. You have lived your life as a beta male. I wonder that your tastes must match."
"Match?" Will asked, feeling increasingly agitated by the direction of this conversation, and certain that he would not enjoy what it was steering toward.
"Many beta males prefer women,"
Hannibal said, somewhat taken by Will's vivid flush and awkward retreat, as if striving to put distance between them would somehow lessen the severity of his discomfort. "I prefer women to be as any other person on this earth," Will said, horrified by what was being so gently prodded at. "If you mean to inquire as to my other appetites, it will please you to know that I have none." Hannibal's brows rose at that.
"None,"
he echoed, cocking his head with a soft half-smile eloquent of disbelief. Trying to cajole just a glimpse of Will's sharp humor from him, he added,
"Even so moral a person as yourself will have other appetites, Chaplain Graham."
"I will not discuss this," Will said, indignant, fully prepared to go into his suite and slam the door in Hannibal's face to escape this awful conversation. Have you so little respect for me that you would engage me in a conversation so tasteless?
Taste is precisely what this conversation revolves around. And I ask because I do respect you, and will respect your answer, Will. Do your preferences lie with women, or do they lie with men?
If I said women, Lord Clarges, then would you cease your misguided attempts to please your grandfather? Will asked, hoping it would be so easy that such a small and unimportant lie would change things for the better. He might even escape Hertford House with his life and limbs intact.
Sadly, no,
Hannibal said, disappointed by his answer, his hope of living here with Will suffering a heavy blow.
It is our duty, Will, whatever our preferences and...
He hesitated, thinking of that blonde woman Will had been with, and added,
however distasteful it may be.
Will's brows rose, his flush fading. A distasteful discharge of duty, he said, angling a fathomless look Hannibal's way. How charming. Let's both be grateful that my disinterest in you spares us the horror we might otherwise face. Your virtue is perfectly safe with me, Lord Clarges, however little it is worth. Before Hannibal could say one word to explain himself, Will opened the door of his suite with forced calm, and strode within as quickly as he could before closing it firmly in Hannibal's face. Hannibal had not been prepared for Will's reaction, nor his own strange response to it, however little it is worth. It stung him, that soft barb, delivered with such placid calm. It stung him because Will was right. Though it was expected conduct of gentlemen to seek the pleasure of company where they pleased in lieu of a spouse's favours, he did not at all enjoy feeling cheap. Hannibal retreated to his suite to wash off the travel dust, casting more than one glance at the washroom door that fed onto Will's room. He had the strangest compulsion to seek him out, and admit that he had seen Will in Duxbury with a woman, to ask him how he knew of her, who she was, to find out the truth of where Will's desires ran. To be honest and tell him that it did not seem a horror, that duty did not have to be onerous. Sex and love were things Hannibal had little interest in for the most part, outside of the purpose they could serve from those around him, but his interests were leaning toward Will with surprising regularity. He had never been demonstrative that he could ever remember, not since the loss of Misha. Even his mistresses had been kept at arm's length, given only enough of his attention to keep them from pestering him with complaints, but otherwise serving their purpose for him. But Will was uncommon. When he ran, Hannibal wanted to chase after him. When he was distressed, Hannibal wanted to soothe him. When he was angry, Hannibal wanted to witness his temper. He was perplexing, intelligent, perceptive, unpredictable, and Hannibal was rapidly finding himself hungry for more. He had to find a way around Will's resistance, he knew. It no longer depended on the addendum. There must be a child eventually to carry on the Lecter name, yes, but not for the sake of regaining control of Hertford House. Will's child would be heir for both of them, inheriting Hertford House regardless. Nothing had to change about that, and Hannibal was determined to keep it that way. His plans had folded at right angles from their original intent. The thought of securing Hertford House through Will had lost its appeal. In just a short time of knowing him, the empty shell he had imagined in place of his spouse had found flesh. He was a young man, badly used through no fault of his own, forced into a circumstance he had not asked for by those who did not ask his opinions. He had feelings, hopes, and dreams, all of which had been soundly discounted by the person who was supposed to be his partner in life. And Hannibal, ignorant of omegas, never more than negligently interested in personal relationships, had handled him with all the care of a bull in a china shop. "Well," he said, dressing after his bath and still thoughtful, but determined to seek a new start. "I did not have to repeat those mistakes." "My lord?" Berger asked, putting the finishing touches on dressing him, and curious about his sudden statement. "Have my horse brought around, Berger. And send word to grandfather I am heading to Fernhill." Yes, my lord," Berger said. Then, after a hesitant pause, he asked, "You're not after Lord du Maurier?" Hannibal chuckled at that, amused. "No, Berger. If I was going to call my cousin out, I'd have done it 6 years ago. Let us hope Bedelia has not packed off back to the capital as yet, now that the distinguished garden party has concluded." "Of course, my lord," Berger said, satisfied on that count. He scurried off to do as he was bidden, leaving Hannibal fairly well pleased with himself. He would see Bedelia and find out just precisely what it would take to appeal to Will's Omega nature. They could learn together, he and Will, more about each other, more about themselves. They could learn to tolerate one another and, eventually, enjoy one another's company. The rest surely would sort just fine from there, and they could work something out between them to their mutual satisfaction. Love wasn't necessary to create a connection, after all. Kindness and polite attention, as Grandfather had told him, could serve just as well to begin with. One had to start somewhere, after all. It wasn't as if either one of them had any illusions about love. So what other way could there possibly be? Will did not wait to calm himself once he gained the privacy of his suite. He went directly to his jewelry box and pried up the lining to secret the letter beneath, hopefully hiding it well enough to keep it from prying eyes. The contents, however, were not so easy to dismiss. Hannibal was responsible for his accident. Will wiped his brow, tugging fretfully at his neckerchief, overwarm and anxious. He heard movement in the washroom, the slosh of water as his husband bathed. His memory conjured the image of Hannibal the day he burst in on his bath, stripped to his waist and still shedding more clothes, his inherent alpha strength slumbering but never entirely absent. A strength he would turn against Will without compunction. "I am never unarmed," he breathed, blotting at his damp brow with his sleeve. "I am never unarmed." He calmed by slow degrees, soothed by the mantra he knew to the core of himself was true. He had his wits, had his knowledge, he had his gift, and with those things he was far more dangerous an opponent than his husband might expect him to be. "You are not an Omega, Will Graham," he told himself, staring sternly at his reflection, bolstering his confidence in his own strength. "You are not a man, nor a woman, you are only yourself, and that is all you need be." He ran downstairs and tended to his appearance in time it took Jimmy to reach him. "Jimmy, please have my mare saddled and bring a fresh horse for Mr. Dollaride," he said, feeling Hannibal's presence just a room away like a physical touch against his nerves. "Mrs. Pims has taken care of him, has she not?" "Yes, Mr. Graham. He's fed and had tea and unpacked already," Jimmy said, his smile uncertain. "Rather a hasty man, your Mr. Dollaride." "In this instance his efficiency serves my purposes. Tell him he is to meet me downstairs. I'll be tending to some estate business this afternoon, and he is to accompany me." "Mr. Graham," Jimmy said, visibly reluctant to do so and obviously disturbed by his plans, "are you sure you should be alone with a stranger who also happens to be a pretty intimidating alpha?" "He is no stranger to me," Will said, though that was not entirely true, as he recalled very little about Francis in the least from his childhood. But Mina had sent him, and Mina, for all her spoiled behavior, was the one person in the world who had ever tried to shield him, little though she had succeeded. She was his twin, another half of his to make a whole, and he trusted her now as he always had, fully and without any option to do otherwise. "Mr. Graham, if I may—" "Please, Jimmy," Will said, weary and worn. "Please do as I say." "Of course, Mr. Graham," Jimmy said, contrite. "He'll be waiting at the door downstairs. And in case it might matter, Mr. Graham, Lord Clarges has asked for his horse to be saddled. You might take a few moments." "Thank you, Jimmy," Will breathed, glad to have been warned, and waited in the silent room once Jimmy left, listening for some indication Hannibal had already gone. It was only once he'd heard him descend downstairs that Will wondered where he might be going, or, worse, who he might have gone to see, now that he knew he would find no welcome in Will's own bed.